Vice President Pence announced official plans today for a new branch of the military, the Space Force. It will become the sixth branch of the U.S. military, that is, if Congress approves it. Vice President Pence laid out the rationale behind the Space Force at the Pentagon earlier.
As Commander-in-Chief, President Trump's highest priority is the safety and security of the American people. And while too often previous administrations all but neglected the growing security threats emerging in space, President Trump stated clearly and forcefully that space is, in his words, a war-fighting domain just like land and air and sea.
Now, the first step in creating a Space Force would be the launch of a U.S. Space Command by the end of the year. Vice President Pence said he hopes to have the Space Force standing on its own by 2020. Joining me now to discuss this is former Secretary of the Air Force, Deborah Lee James. She's also a cipher brief expert. First, Deborah, what was your initial reaction to the announcement of a Space Force branch of the U.S. military?
Well, Errol, my initial thought was having a separate branch of the U.S. military was really a solution in search of a problem. But with that said, I'm fully in favor of having a separate and distinct warfighting command to be able to focus on the warfighting aspects of space.
Now, supporters of this idea, which is of course originating with President Trump, say that a Space Force is needed because the Air Force doesn't pay enough attention to space. They claim China and Russia pose a threat to U.S. interests from space. What's your response to that argument?
Well, the first thing I want you and your viewers to know, Errol, is that the United States is the #1 spacefaring country on the planet, and we have assets and people that are second to none. Now, with that said, what's been happening in recent years is some of our potential adversaries across the world have been investing and testing in ways that are worrisome to the United States, in ways where they too are securing capabilities which we view ultimately as a possible threat. And so that is why, contrary to what Vice President Pence said, actually for some number of years, we have been pumping billions of dollars more into the space programs, not to stand up a new bureaucracy, but rather to invest in new technology and new capabilities. That is what will make the difference going forward.
And on that financial point, more than 15% of the U.S. federal budget is already spent on the military. And if you look at funding of NASA, for example, that's been slashed, and NASA is now having to partner with private organizations to send people up into space. So what about the funding for such an entity? Where would that come from, and do you think could that be justified?
Well, the funding would come the same place that funding always comes from. The president would need to propose it, and then Congress would need to agree with it and would need to appropriate it. Now, I am one who is actually supportive of the fact that our defense budget has been increasing over the last several years. I think we do have important readiness and capability and people issues that we need to keep on top of, but I simply don't believe that the money required to set up a whole new bureaucracy is the right way to go. I would rather see additional monies go to technology, people, and capability.
Now, perhaps it's an aspect of the Vice President selling this idea, but VP Pence said that this Space Force branch would be initially led by a civilian. What do you make of that suggestion?
Well, if indeed there were to be a separate and distinct military service, it would need to be led by a civilian. In our country, we have a very important principle, and that is civilian control of the military. So just as when I was the Secretary of the Air Force, I am a civilian, if there were to be a new space branch, that too would be led by a civilian. But I come back to the main point. If warfighting is the key issue, and that is certainly what the president has said, a separate branch of the military is not your solution. The military services focus on people, equipping, and training. They're all about the budgets and how to invest. It is the combatant commands that focus on warfighting. And so that is why I do support one of the proposals, and that is to create a separate and distinct Space Command.
All right, former Air Force Secretary Deborah Lee James, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you, Errol.